La mayoría de ellos provienen de los Estados Unidos y van a parar a las arcas de un régimen totalmente totalitario. Es algo realmente increíble.
The medical missions are primarily a way of selling Cuban health care services abroad. But what's healthcare like for those living on the island?
Cuba, quite surprisingly, has a very advanced biopharma industry.
Unlike the rest of the developing world, there's no doctor shortage in Cuba.
We've seen wide improvements of Cuban health across the population.
Providing a kind of care that's both personal and persistent.
Trabajé en hospitales muy del pueblo, de la gente de a pie, con condiciones pésimas de trabajo, donde son contadas las jeringuillas que hay en el día esterilizadas para poder inyectar a un paciente. Los espéculos, que es el instrumento con que se hacen los exámenes vaginales a las mujeres embarazadas o a cualquier mujer.
Cuando ponen un documental, ponen el mejor policlínico, ponen el mejor hospital. Por ejemplo, yo antes de venir para acá trabajé en una clínica internacional, los 2 años antes de venir.
Una clínica internacional es donde van los turistas.
Donde van los turistas. Sí. Yo trabajé en la clínica internacional Cira que está en Playa. Allí, por supuesto, que la atención es mejor. Ahí hay todos los medicamentos, ahí hay todos los medios diagnósticos para hacer los pacientes, las camas son diferentes. Por supuesto, eso es turismo. Ve a un turista y lo primero que está pensando es que te va a dejar $20. Porque te va a resolver. Con $20 vas a tener más que el salario que tú tienes el mes entero. Entonces, ese paciente tú lo priorizas, le das la mejor atención porque es la forma que tienes de salir adelante.
Hay 2 sistemas de salud en Cuba. Uno destinado a la población común y otro destinado al turismo y al personal de élite.
When defenders of Cuban healthcare acknowledge its deficiencies at all, they usually point the finger at the U.S. trade embargo, which has been in place since 1962.
For decades, Cuba has heavily invested in its medical and pharmaceutical system, in part because of the 6-decade-old U.S. embargo.
Cubans tend to blame their hardships on the U.S. trade embargo. One of the biggest problems remains the embargo of medicine from U.S. pharmaceutical companies.
But the deplorable conditions in Cuban hospitals have more to do with a lack of basic healthcare supplies, which are readily available from other countries, such as antibiotics and steroids. Cuban hospitals also have a shortage of beds and stretchers, and some are without water for 6 to 12 hours a day at the height of the pandemic. So what impact does the embargo really have on Cuban healthcare? Medical products have been technically exempt from the embargo since the passage of the 1992 Cuba Democracy Act, but the law does stipulate that U.S. companies need a license in order to sell to Cuba. And critics are correct to point out that this requirement adds red tape to the process. Total U.S. healthcare products purchased by Cuba from 2003 to 2021 averaged a mere $1.4 million annually, in what should be a $50 to $100 million market. But it's not the licensing process that accounts for such paltry sales. Companies would gladly obtain permission to sell their products to Cuba if they could earn enough money to make it worth the effort. Cuba has a severe foreign currency shortage because it produces little in the way of goods and services that the rest of the world wants to buy.
¿Y de quién es culpa eso? ¿Del gobierno de Estados Unidos? No, señor mío. Eso es culpa del gobierno de Cuba. Porque ron, la bebida alcohólica, no falta. ¿Sí? El cigarro tampoco falta.
Promoters of Cuban healthcare often cite the country's infant mortality rate as evidence of its success.
And yet, the Cubans are able to have a lower infant mortality rate than the United States.
Cuba has similar life expectancy and lower infant mortality than the United States.
How is this possible, that an American infant is, by official statistics, almost 50% more likely to die than a Cuban infant, wrote Nicholas Kristof in a 2019 New York Times column that looked at one of the most often repeated figures in support of the claim that there's something exceptional about Cuba's healthcare system. While conceding that the figures should be taken with a dose of skepticism, Kristof chose to interpret them regardless in support of his priors. Cuba has a Medicare for all that many Americans dream about.
Por ejemplo, las cifras que publica el régimen cubano acerca de una tasa de mortalidad infantil muy baja.
En Cuba todo se manipula.
Cuba has a variety of strategies for manipulating its infant mortality rate, such as seeing to it that fetuses less likely to survive outside the womb never get the chance. There's significant evidence that Cuban doctors coerce women into aborting fetuses shown to have abnormalities after routine ultrasounds.
We have to understand that the physicians in Cuba are a member of the army. and they have to meet certain targets in terms of infant mortality. If they don't meet those targets, they face penalties.
Vincent Geloso, who's an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University, co-authored a 2018 paper arguing that Cuba's low infant mortality rate, in part, is a result of misclassification using a different indicator known as late fetal deaths.
Late fetal deaths are things that happen before birth, and early neonatal deaths, so in the first 7 days. That means you reclassify the early 7-day deaths as late fetal deaths. That way they don't pop into the official statistics. And we can actually look at statistics of how the ratio of late fetal death to early neonatal death are for most Western countries. The ratio is generally 4-to-1, 6-to-1, whereas Cuba is like an outlier, where it's 14 or 15-to-1, which is a clear sign of this distorted set of incentives. So there is, once you adjust for that, you find that Cuba's infant mortality rate goes as high as doubles, sometimes increases by half of what it is, sometimes twice what it is.
Despite reports early in the pandemic that Cuba was an outlier in its success in combating COVID,
Cuba has far surpassed the United States when it comes to COVID-19 and people surviving.
Y de repente hubo un rebrote que colapsó todos los servicios.
by August of 2021, the New York Times was reporting that Cuba's healthcare system was reeling, with oxygen supplies running low, a shortage of syringes, and mortuaries and crematories overwhelmed. President Miguel Díaz-Canel blamed the U.S. trade embargo.
Los médicos subiendo videos para las redes sociales del caos que había, las personas diciendo que no hay medicamentos, no hay médicos, quiere decir que no funciona.
En estos momentos, la isla colapsó. El sistema de salud colapsó. Los hospitales abarrotados, la gente muriéndose en los pasillos, los pacientes sin oxígeno, hospitales sin corriente eléctrica, no tienen la suficiente fuerza o energía para tratar casos de esta magnitud.
Dr. Rios has 3 kids, ages 7, 12, and 16, still living in Cuba, and he's hoping to bring them to the U.S.
Que en Cuba, siendo médico especialista con tantos años, no podía hacerlo. Aunque mira, ahora mismo estoy trabajando como ayudante de carpintería. Y soy especialista hace más de 8 años, pero no me importa. Porque como ayudante de carpintería puedo mantenerme yo y puedo ayudar a mantener a mi mamá, por ejemplo, a mantener a mis hijos en Cuba. Yo dije que quería ser médico a los 9 años, pero hasta que eso llegue tengo que hacer lo que tenga que hacer. ¿Y quieres que te sea sincero? No me importa. De verdad. Sinceramente te lo digo.
El pueblo cubano va a despertar. El pueblo cubano va a levantarse más fuerte que nunca. El pueblo cubano se dio cuenta que no existía ningún enemigo exterior ni un enemigo anterior. El enemigo del pueblo cubano es el gobierno cubano.
Because the enemy is Biden.